Hey, all. Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, I find researching and sharing stories of how soldiers and sailors acted, reacted, coped with battle and battle conditions helps me to understand what war does to the mind and helps me to better appreciate the human condition of those men who were faced with the uncertainties of combat, particularly during the Civil War years. Many of these volunteer citizen soldiers who had not much more than basic training, or maybe were lucky enough to find an infantry manual. Well, you learn a lot through these men of their courage, their grit and determination, and how they dealt with the psychology of being on the battlefield. But they were not alone. It's easy to forget that there were hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of horses that were also there. Well, how did our four-legged friends fare when facing the zip, zip, zip of many bullets or the whoosh and whiz of artillery fire on the field of battle? What exactly ran through their minds as these metal objects were flying all about them and the ground was literally shaking beneath their feet as trees above and near them were being shattered, as some of the men on their backs riding them, were shot down? What fears did they feel from, or fears did they feel from their rider? Hard to know. But today's research took me to the November 1861 Battle of Belmont in Missouri, largely remembered today as Ulysses S. Grant's first fight in the Civil War. Well, one of the Union surgeons who participated in that battle, Major John Hill Brinton, who was at the beginning of a stellar career that would take him to prominent circles in the U.S. Army medical establishment, part of that time as a staff officer to Grant, and after the war to prominence as a surgeon in the United States. Well, he mentioned the effects of shot and shell on horses and mules during the Battle of Belmont in his 1891 autobiography titled Personal Memoirs of John H. Brinton, Major and Surgeon, USV, 1861 to 1865. I want to share these passages with you just to give you a sense of what the war was like from the perspective of horses and mules. So here we go. Here's the beginning, the first passage where Brinton mentions them. He says, I was much struck this day of the Battle of Belmont, November 7th, 1861, with the behavior of animals when terrified. Thus, my horse, when he and I were exposed to the terrific shell fire of the gunboats, was thoroughly, may I say, unhorsed. A little sense of humor from Brinton. He, the horse, was no longer the kicking, fractious beast of the morning. He was entirely subdued and trembled and shook and seemed scarcely able to stand. Then, too, he appeared to recognize me as his master, and when I dismounted to see the wounded, he showed no disposition to wander or leave me, but stood with his nose close to me. It was scarcely necessary to hold his bridle, he was so quiet and companionable. Again, when I rode over the field alone, several mules followed me closely. They could not get too close to me. One fellow in particular, without a bridle, a big white creature with extraordinary ears, stuck to my side as if we had been friends all our lives. I suppose he was what was then called a secession mule, secession rebel, captured or set free at the destruction of the enemy's camp. I mounted more than one wounded man on him, and he did not fall behind. It was upon him that a poor lad, not more than 16 or 17, who had been shot through the lung, died. I reported the case in my paper on the instantaneous rigor of sudden or violent death in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences. In this lad's case, the rigor was so quick and marked that I had much difficulty in removing his body from the animal. So tightly were the legs clasped around the sides of the mule. The string of mules accompanied me until I reached the river bank. So that's the first passage. Now, a little bit in a different part of the battlefield, a little bit later, Brinton, is moving about trying to understand where he is in context to the Mississippi River while the battle is continuing. And the movement of enemy troops and friendly troops is a little bit unknown. He's in the chaos and confusion of battle. So that's the setting. Now let's get into what he has to say about it. Here's where Brinton begins. He writes, I wandered aimlessly around, trying to keep a general direction parallel to the Mississippi River. Suddenly, in the midst of a dense forest of primeval trees, I was startled by the loud report of a heavy gun directly in front of me, and by the whiz and bursting of a shell in the tops of the trees above my head. It instantly flashed on my mind that there must be a force of the enemy just ahead of me, and that our gunboats were firing into them with possibly too great elevation of their guns. I checked my horse at once and stopped to think what I had best do. If I advanced, I should inevitably fall into the hands of the enemy if they were where I supposed them to be. If I rode backwards, I would run the risk of being killed by our own shells, which were falling behind me. I felt very uncomfortable, not so much at the idea of being hurt as at the idea of being away from all assistance in case of injury. My horse too, became demoralized. He stopped and shook all over, and there seemed to be none of the spirit of the morning in him. Then, to add to it all, a great shell struck the top of the tree under which we were standing and cut all of the upper part of it squarely off, and down it fell, point foremost. I remember it all most distinctly, how that stem of the tree looked as it struck the ground perpendicularly. Just then, the direction of the fire seemed to shift, and the missiles seemed to strike more in front and to my left. So I rode away, and after a while, struck the bed of an unfinished railroad. Brinton continues talking about the rest of the battle. It's really his first serious experience in war and in combat. And you have to think too, same is true for these horses. They had never heard these sounds of battle. They had never been in combat on a battlefield. Clearly, they were feeling angst about that. As Brinton tells us in his writings, the horses and mules stuck close by, perhaps looking to have some protection or the comfort of a human being as they were going through this devastation caused by human beings. So, thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.